He hadn't planned to stop. Men like Marcus Hale never stopped. Not for traffic, not for weather, not for anything that wasn't worth $1 million or more. But tonight, somewhere between a closed highway in Connecticut and a rerouted GPS that had clearly lost its mind, his black Bentley rolled to a slow stop outside a place called Ellie's Corner Diner on the edge of Bridgeport, the kind of establishment that looked like it hadn't updated its sign since 1987. The rain was coming down in sheets. His driver, a quiet man named Theo, glanced in the rearview mirror without a word. Marcus stared at the glowing diner window, at the warm yellow light bleeding out onto the wet pavement, and said, 5 minutes. That was a lie. He just didn't know it yet. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me, because what happens inside that diner will be the last thing you expect from a man like him. Marcus Hale was not a man you looked at twice unless you wanted to be noticed looking. 41, broad-shouldered, the kind of quiet that made rooms go still. His name moved through New York's underworld the way smoke moves through a building. Everywhere, invisible, impossible to catch. He ran operations across 3 states, owned legitimate real estate from Manhattan to Hartford, and had not once in 15 years allowed himself to feel something he couldn't control. He pushed open the diner door. A small bell rang overhead. The smell hit him first: coffee, warm butter, something faintly sweet like cinnamon. It was the kind of smell that didn't belong in his life. He stood at the entrance for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, and that 1 second was enough. She was across the room with her back to him, reaching up to slide a plate onto a high shelf behind the counter. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot at the back of her neck, a few strands falling free against her brown skin. She wore a pale blue apron over a white shirt, and she was laughing at something the old man at the counter had just said, a real laugh, unguarded and bright, the kind of laugh that didn't care who was listening. Marcus went completely still. His chest did something it had no business doing, because he knew that laugh. He had heard it 1,000 times on a basketball court in Harlem when they were 17 years old, and the whole world felt like it was still possible. Delilah. Delilah Crane. He hadn't said her name out loud in over 12 years. He hadn't let himself. A hostess appeared at his elbow, asking if he'd like a table, but he barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on the woman across the room who still hadn't turned around. When she finally did, it wasn't because she sensed him. It was because a new customer had walked in behind him, and the bell rang again, and she looked up automatically with a smile already forming. And then she saw him. The smile didn't fall. It froze, like time itself decided to pause and wait for both of them to catch up. Table for 1, sir, the hostess repeated. Marcus cleared his throat. Yes, he said, though sitting still was the last thing he was capable of right now. He followed the hostess to a corner booth, lowered himself into the seat, and kept his eyes on the menu he wasn't reading. But he could feel her gaze from across the room like a hand pressed flat against his chest. He hadn't come here for this. He hadn't come here for anything. And yet, something told him, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that the flat tire his driver had narrowly avoided, the closed highway, the rerouted GPS, all of it had led him exactly here. To her. He just didn't know yet what it was going to cost him. She gave herself exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds to breathe, to press one hand flat against the counter, to remind herself who she was and where she was, and that the man sitting in booth 7 was just a customer. Just a customer. Delilah Crane had survived worse than an unexpected phase from her past. She had survived a mother who left when she was 9, a college fund that disappeared when her uncle got sick, and 4 years of rebuilding herself from scratch in Bridgeport with nothing but 2 suitcases and a stubbornness that her grandmother used to call a gift and everyone else called a problem. She could survive Marcus Hale sitting in her section on a rainy Tuesday night. She picked up her notepad. She walked over. "Welcome to Ellie's," she said, her voice landing smooth and professional. Can I start you off with something to drink? He looked up from the menu. Up close, he was different and exactly the same. The jaw was sharper now. There were faint lines near his eyes that hadn't been there before. His suit was dark and immaculate, and he wore it the way powerful men wear things, like it was simply an extension of who he already was. But his eyes were identical to the ones she remembered. Dark, steady, and always seeing more than they should. Delilah, he said. Not a question, just her name, spoken quietly, like he was confirming something he already knew. She kept her expression neutral. Marcus. One word back. Even. Unbothered. Or so she needed him to believe. He set the menu down. You look well. She almost laughed. Almost. You want coffee or not? He paused, and then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something close. Black. No sugar. She wrote it down, even though she didn't need to, and walked back to the counter without looking over her shoulder. But her hand was shaking when she reached for the coffee pot. Just slightly. Just enough. She noticed. She hoped he hadn't. He had. Marcus watched her move through the diner with the careful attention he usually reserved for people who were either a threat or a puzzle. Delilah Crane had always been both. They had grown up 6 blocks apart in Harlem. Same school, different worlds. She was the girl who read books on the fire escape and argued with teachers and made everyone around her feel like they were standing in a brighter light. He was already knee-deep in a life she didn't know about, running errands for men whose names he didn't say out loud. They had been close the way young people are close when they haven't yet learned how much the world will ask of them, completely, recklessly, with no thought of what it would mean to lose it. Then one night, everything cracked. A phone call, a decision he made without telling her. And by morning she was gone, and he had spent 12 years telling himself it was better that way, that she was safer away from him, that he had done the right thing. He had believed that, mostly, until right now, watching her refill a stranger's coffee with that same quiet grace she used to have sitting on her fire escape, and realizing that telling yourself something enough times doesn't make it true. It just makes it familiar. She came back with his coffee, set it down without spilling a drop. He noticed the small scar on the side of her right hand, new since he last knew her, and he wanted to ask. He didn't. Anything else? She asked. Give me a minute, he said. She nodded and turned to leave, and he said her name again, Delilah, just once, and she stopped walking but didn't turn around. It's good to see you, he said. A pause, long enough to mean something. Then she said, quietly and without turning, I'll check back on you in a few minutes. And she walked away. But what he didn't see was the way she pressed her back against the wall behind the counter and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Because she hadn't expected this. And she had no idea that by the end of the night, everything she had rebuilt was going to be tested. The diner thinned out slowly. By 9 o'clock, only 3 tables were occupied. By 9:30, it was just Marcus and an elderly couple near the window, sharing a slice of pie. Delilah wiped down the counter and told herself this was fine. He was just a man, just a customer, just someone she used to know before she knew better. She had almost convinced herself when he stood up from the booth and walked toward her. Not to the register, not to the door, but directly toward the counter, like he had made a decision and wasn't going to second-guess it. He sat on one of the stools. She raised an eyebrow. Check, she asked. Not yet. She set her cloth down. Marcus, it's been a long night. I know, he said. Mine too. Sit with me for a minute. I'm working. The diner closes in 20 minutes, and there are 2 customers left, and I think we both know we're not going to let each other walk away tonight without saying something real. She stared at him. He stared back. The rain against the window filled the silence between them. And then, slowly, she pulled out the stool on her side of the counter and sat. Not because he told her to, because he was right, and she hated that. You look like you're doing well, she said, which was the most neutral thing she could manage. I'm doing what I know how to do, he said carefully. That's not always the same thing. She tilted her head. Cryptic as ever. Honest as ever, he corrected. She looked down at the counter. Why are you really in Bridgeport, Marcus? A beat. Rerouted. Highway closure. And you just happened to stop here. I didn't plan it. Men like you don't do anything they don't plan. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're right. But sometimes life makes plans for you. She didn't answer, because she knew exactly what he meant. 12 years ago, she hadn't planned to overhear a phone call that told her more about Marcus Hale than he had ever told her himself. She hadn't planned to pack her things that same night. She hadn't planned any of it, but she had done it anyway, and she had never told him why. You just disappeared, he said. His voice was even, controlled, but underneath it she heard something she wasn't expecting, something that sounded like it had been sitting there a very long time. I know, she said. I had to, without a word. Yes. Delilah, Marcus. She met his eyes. There are things I knew about your life that you never told me. Things I wasn't supposed to know. And I was 24 years old, and I was scared, and I made the only choice that felt safe. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. He didn't look away from her. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the counter and very still, the way still water is still right before something moves underneath it. What did you hear? He asked quietly. She held his gaze. Enough, she said, and the word landed between them like a stone dropped into deep water. He exhaled slowly through his nose and looked down at the counter, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, Delilah saw something on his face she had never once seen there before. Not guilt, not anger, something rawer than both, something that looked a lot like grief. And she was not prepared for that, not even a little. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Delilah didn't rush him. She had learned long ago that silence from a man like Marcus Hale wasn't emptiness, it was weight. It was everything he was deciding whether or not to carry out loud. Finally, he said, I should have told you. 3 words. Simple, but they landed in her chest like something breaking open. She kept her face still. Told me what, exactly? He looked up. Everything. What I was into, who I was working for. I should have told you instead of letting you find out the way you did. She blinked. How do you know how I found out? Because I know you, he said. You don't run without a reason. And you were too loyal to run unless the reason was something you couldn't argue with. She looked away first. Outside, the rain had slowed to a quiet drizzle, the streetlight catching it in long silver threads. 12 years. 12 years of building a new life in a new city, of working her way up from nothing, of learning how to want less so that losing things hurt less. And here was the reason for all of it, sitting on a diner stool in a suit that cost more than her rent, telling her he should have told her the truth. It wouldn't have changed anything, she said. You don't know that. Marcus, you would have stayed, he said. If I had been honest with you, you would have stayed, and I couldn't, he stopped. His hand moved slightly on the counter, a barely visible tightening of his fingers. I couldn't let you stay, he said quietly. Not in that life. Not next to what I was doing. I told myself you were safer gone. I told myself I was protecting you. Delilah was very still. Her heart was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. And now, she asked. He met her eyes. And now I'm sitting here, 12 years later, watching you wipe down counters in a diner in Bridgeport and wondering if protecting you was the kindest thing I ever did or the worst mistake of my life. The elderly couple near the window asked for their check. Delilah stood automatically, pulled it together, delivered it with a steady hand and a practiced smile. But when she came back to the counter and sat down again, something between them had shifted, like a door neither of them had meant to open was now standing wide. You didn't make me leave, she said finally. I made that choice. Because of what I was. Because of what you chose, she corrected softly. There's a difference. He absorbed that, nodded once slowly, like he had needed to hear it said out loud by her specifically. The elderly couple left. The door swung shut behind them. The diner was empty now except for the two of them and the cook, who had turned up the radio in the back and clearly had no intention of interrupting. "I'm not that person anymore," Marcus said. Delilah looked at him carefully. She had learned not to take statements like that at face value. "People don't just walk away from what you were," she said. "No," he agreed. "They don't just walk away. It takes years and choices and consequences you live with every day." A pause. "But they can walk away." She studied his face. The lines she didn't recognize. The stillness she did. "Are you out?" she asked directly. He didn't flinch. Mostly isn't out." "No," he said. "It's not. But it's the most honest answer I can give you." She respected that more than she wanted to. And somewhere in the space between his honesty and her caution, something old and stubborn and deeply buried in her chest stirred quietly back to life. She told it to stop. It didn't listen. She locked up at 10:15. The cook, a broad man named Gerald who had worked at Ellie's for 11 years and never once asked personal questions, gave her a knowing look on his way out that she chose to ignore entirely. Marcus was waiting outside under the narrow overhang, jacket on, hands in his pockets, watching the street the way men who have spent their lives watching streets always do. Not anxiously, but completely. Like danger was something he had made peace with a long time ago. She pulled her coat on and stood beside him. The rain had stopped. The street smelled like wet concrete and something faintly floral from the bakery 2 doors down. "You don't have to wait," she said. "I know," he said. They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching a car move slowly through a puddle on the road. "I parked at the end of the block," he said. "My driver's probably asleep." "You have a driver. I told you. Real estate." She laughed at that, a small, reluctant sound that she couldn't quite stop. He turned his head toward her when she laughed, and something in his expression shifted in a way she noticed and wasn't ready to name. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a command. It wasn't quite a question either. It was an invitation, careful and quiet, like he was aware it could be declined. She should have said no. She knew every reason to say no. Instead, she said short walk. "I have an early shift." He nodded and they started walking, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm on the damp sidewalk. And for a stretch of almost a full minute, neither of them said anything and somehow that said everything. "Do you like it here?" he asked eventually. "Bridgeport." She considered it honestly. "It's not what I planned, but it's mine. I built something here." "What did you build?" "A life," she said simply. "Small, steady, real." He glanced at her sideways. "Is that enough?" It was a real question, not a challenge. She felt the difference. "It is," she said. "It has been." A pause. "But," she looked at him. "I didn't say but. You didn't have to." She exhaled softly. And because it was late and she was tired and something about the quiet Bridgeport street made honesty feel less dangerous, she said, "Some days I wonder what I traded away." When I left, he was quiet. "You traded chaos," he said carefully. "Danger. Uncertainty." "I know," she said. "I also traded." She stopped herself. He waited. She shook her head once. "It doesn't matter." "Delilah." His voice was low. Her name and his voice had always done something unfair to her equilibrium. "Say it," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped with her. They were at the end of the block now, his car visible 20 feet ahead, and the city was quiet around them, and she looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time all night without her guard fully in place. "I traded the only person who ever made me feel like the world was big enough for what I wanted," she said, even if everything around him was wrong. The words settled in the air between them like something delicate. He looked at her with an expression she had no defenses left for. Not after 12 years. Not at the end of a night like this. He reached out slowly, and she didn't move back. His fingers touched the side of her face, just briefly, barely there, impossibly gentle for a man whose hands had done things she'd rather not think about, and she felt it everywhere. "I never stopped," he said quietly. 12 years. I never stopped. Her throat was tight. "Marcus, you don't have to say anything," he said. "I'm not asking for anything tonight." She believed him, and that, more than anything he could have said or done, was what undid her completely. She reached up and covered his hand with hers before she could talk herself out of it, and he went very still, like something fragile had just been placed in his care, and he understood exactly how serious that was. He called the next morning. She didn't answer. He called again that afternoon. She didn't answer that time either. She was standing in the middle of her small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Stratford Avenue, holding her phone, watching his name appear on the screen, talking herself through every reason why picking up was the wrong thing to do. She had a life here. She had built it carefully and quietly, piece by piece, without anyone's help. She had her shift at Ellie's. She had her Tuesday night pottery class and the small reading group she'd joined at the library on State Street, and the window box she'd been growing herbs in since April. She had structure. She had peace. Marcus Hale was not peace. He was the opposite of peace. He was every complicated, dangerous, beautiful thing she had spent 12 years walking away from. Her phone buzzed. A text this time. It said, "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you for coffee." She stared at it for a long time. Then she typed back, "1 coffee." That's it. His response came in 4 seconds. "I'll take it." They met the following Saturday at a place in downtown Bridgeport that was not Ellie's, neutral ground, her choice. He was already there when she arrived, which surprised her. Men like Marcus were never early. She noted it but didn't comment. He had dressed differently this time. Still sharp but softer. Dark sweater. No visible arme. She sat down across from him, and the server came, and they ordered, and for the first 5 minutes they talked about nothing. The neighborhood, the coffee, whether Connecticut winters were as brutal as people said. It was easy. Dangerously easy. The kind of easy that reminded her how naturally they had always fallen into each other's rhythm. "You've been thinking," he said, because he could always tell. "I'm always thinking," she replied. "About this," he said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I have questions." "Ask them." "All of them." "Every single one," he said. "I'm done keeping things from you." She looked at him steadily, and then she asked. Everything she had carried for 12 years, what she had overheard that night, what it had meant, what she had feared, what she had grieved. She asked without softening it. He answered without flinching, not defensively, not with excuses, just with the quiet, unflinching honesty of a man who had spent a long time deciding who he wanted to be and had finally arrived there. By the time they finished their second coffee, something between them had shifted so fundamentally that going back to before felt not just impossible, but pointless. "I'm not all the way out," he said again. Honest, like the first time. "But I'm building something different. Legitimate. Real. And I want it to be a life I'm not ashamed of." She was quiet for a moment. "That's going to take time. I know. And I'm not waiting around for a man who might or might not get there." "I'm not asking you to wait," he said. "I'm asking you to walk alongside me, at whatever pace you decide." She studied him. This man who had once been the center of everything she felt and the source of everything that scared her, who had sat at her diner on a rainy Tuesday night like a reminder that life doesn't always give you closure. Sometimes it gives you another chance instead. "One step at a time," she said finally. He nodded. "One step." She reached across the table and picked up her coffee, and he looked at her hand and then at her face, and the look in his eyes was something she had not seen there since they were 17, and the world still felt like it was full of open doors. 3 months later, she still worked at Ellie's. Not because she had to, because she had learned to love the steadiness of it, the smell of coffee, the regulars who called her by name, the sense that she had built something real in this city. But things were different now. Better. Marcus came in every Friday evening. He sat in booth 7. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and she always brought it without writing it down. They were not rushing. They were not pretending. They were two people who had found each other again after a long time and had chosen, carefully and with full awareness of everything it cost, to try. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances don't always knock on your door, sometimes they walk in through a diner entrance on a rainy Tuesday night, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're waiting on yours, don't stop believing it's coming. Sometimes love just needs time to find its way back home.